The wind out here in the Mojave doesn't just blow. It screams through the empty rib cages of these dead Boeings until you can't tell the difference between a gust of air and a human voice. I was crouched inside the hollowed-out wing of a decommissioned aircraft C-5 Galaxy, my lungs burning with the fine grit of alkaline dust, while the metallic tapping of a hammer against aluminum echoed from just a few yards away. If they found me in here, I wouldn't just be a trespasser anymore. I would be another piece of scrap metal buried under 1,000 tons of rotting fuselage. It started as a simple job for a local salvage contractor who needed an unofficial inventory of the copper wiring left in the older military transport wing. I am not a thief, or at least I didn't think I was, but the pay was triple what I could make at the garage, and the desert at night is usually the quietest place on Earth. The Boneyard stretches for miles, a jagged forest of tails and wings sticking up into the moonlight like the fins of prehistoric sharks. It is beautiful in a way, until you realize that you are completely isolated and the nearest paved road is a 2-hour hike through soft sand and rattlesnake dens. I had been working for about 3 hours, stripped down to a t-shirt despite the desert chill, pulling back the heavy insulation blankets from the interior of the wing. The scale of these planes is hard to describe if you haven't stood inside one, because it feels less like a machine and more like a cathedral made of rivets and oil. I was deep inside the structure, near the point where the wing attaches to the main body, when the sound of a heavy truck engine cut through the whistling wind. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs because nobody was supposed to be out here at 2 in the morning. I clicked off my flashlight immediately, plunging myself into a darkness so thick it felt like I was drowning in ink. I pressed my ear against the cold metal skin of the wing and listened as the truck slowed down, the tires crunching over the dry crust of the earth until it stopped right outside my section. I heard the heavy thud of truck doors closing, followed by the low, gravelly murmur of men who weren't worried about being heard. They weren't security guards, because security doesn't drive unmarked flatbeds with the headlights turned off. I heard the clink of heavy chains and the distinct, terrifying sound of a welding torch sparking to life. "Check the wing sections first," one of them said, his voice sounding unnervingly close through the thin aluminum wall. "The boss wants the high-grade stuff cleared out before the morning shift arrives, and he said he doesn't care how we get it out as long as it's gone." I realized then that I wasn't just hiding from thieves. I was hiding from a professional crew that was likely sanctioned by someone high up in the salvage company. If they caught me, I was a witness to a multi-million-dollar theft, and people don't go to jail for copper when they can just leave a body in a hole in the desert. I began to back away, crawling deeper into the narrowing tip of the wing, my hands scraping against the jagged edges of the structural ribs. The space was getting tighter, the ceiling of the wing sloping down until I was on my stomach, sliding through a narrow tunnel of wires and hydraulic lines. I needed to find another way out, but these wings are built like fortresses, and the only main access point was exactly where those men were standing. The smell of ozone and burning metal began to fill the wing, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that they were welding the main access hatch shut. They weren't coming in to get the copper yet. They were sealing the sections they hadn't checked to make sure no one could interfere while they worked on the main fuselage. My breath hitched in my throat as the realization hit me that I was being buried alive inside a silver coffin. I scrambled back toward the hatch, forgetting about the noise for a second, my boots kicking against the metal floor with a sound like a drum. I reached the hatch just as the white-hot glow of the welding bead finished its circle around the heavy steel handle. I pushed against it with everything I had, my shoulder screaming in pain, but the metal didn't even budge. I was trapped in a space that was slowly becoming an oven as the desert sun began to peek over the horizon, though it was still dark outside for now. I leaned my head against the cold metal and tried to breathe, trying to ignore the sound of the men laughing as they moved their equipment toward the next plane. I had to think, and I had to think fast, because once they finished their sweep and left, I would be stuck in this wing for days before anyone even thought to look here. I remembered that further down the wing, near the fuel tank access, there was a small emergency inspection port that was held in place by a series of heavy bolts. It wasn't meant for a human to pass through, but if I could strip the interior lining, I might be able to squeeze my torso through and drop to the sand below. The problem was the tools. as I had dropped my bag near the main hatch in my panic. I felt around in the dark, my fingers sliding over grease and cold rivets, until I felt the hard plastic handle of a flathead screwdriver I had kept in my back pocket. It was a small tool for a massive job, but it was the only thing standing between me and a slow death in the heat. I crawled back into the narrow darkness, the air getting thinner and hotter as the stress took hold of my body. I found the inspection port by touch, feeling the circular indentation in the floor of the wing. I began to work the screwdriver into the gap, prying at the rusted bolts with a desperation that turned my knuckles white. Outside, the men were getting closer again, their boots heavy on the sand. I heard one of them stop right next to the inspection port, the sound of his breathing clearly audible through the thin metal. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I thought he would hear it through the floor. He spat on the ground, the sound of the liquid hitting the dust like a gunshot in the silence. "You hear something?" he asked, his voice directed at his partner. "Just the wind playing tricks on the scrap," the other replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "This place gives me the creeps at night. Let's just finish the welds and get to the truck." I waited until their footsteps faded toward the front of the plane before I put my entire weight onto the screwdriver. With a sickening crack, the first bolt snapped. I didn't stop. I moved to the next one, my breath coming in ragged gasps. 2 more bolts gave way, and the circular plate shifted, allowing a tiny sliver of moonlight to pierce the interior of the wing. I pushed the plate down, watching it fall into the soft sand below with a muffled thud. The hole was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and I knew I would likely tear my skin on the jagged edges of the aluminum. I didn't care. I exhaled all the air from my lungs, making my chest as small as possible, and wiggled my way into the opening. The metal bit into my ribs, and for a terrifying second, I was stuck, my legs dangling inside the wing and my head hanging out into the cold desert air. I felt the skin on my back rip, a sharp sting that made me want to scream, but I forced myself to remain silent. I kicked my legs, pushing against the interior ribs, and suddenly I popped through, falling face first into the sand. I didn't wait to see if they heard me. I stayed low, crawling on my belly like a lizard, moving away from the silhouettes of the men and their truck. I hid behind the massive tires of a nearby landing gear assembly, watching as they finished welding the last of the wings and climbed back into their flatbed. As the truck roared to life and sped away into the darkness, I slumped against the rubber tire, my body shaking with a violent release of tension. I was bleeding, I was exhausted, and I was miles from home, but I was out. I looked back at the wing of the C5, a silver tomb that almost claimed me, and I started to walk toward the distant glow of the highway. I realized then that some things are left in the boneyard for a reason, and I was never going to come back to find out why. I reached the main road just as the sun broke over the mountains, the light turning the aircraft boneyard into a field of gold and fire. I looked like a ghost, covered in dust and blood, but I knew I had survived. The sun had barely dipped below the jagged horizon of the Mojave when the silence of the boneyard began to feel heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I was working a contract shift for a private liquidation firm, tasked with logging the serial numbers of every remaining seat in a row of 7 gutted Boeing 737s that had been stacked together like discarded toys. These planes were hollowed-out shells, stripped of their engines, their avionics, and their dignity, leaving nothing but the skeletal remains of a cabin and the lingering smell of stale coffee and old upholstery. My supervisor had told me the yard was empty, that I was the only soul authorized to be among the rows of rotting aluminum, but the desert has a way of making you feel like 1,000 eyes are watching you from the shadows of the tail fins. I climbed into the second fuselage using a rusted maintenance ladder, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the thick layer of dust dancing in the air. The cabin was a tunnel of gray shadows, with most of the overhead bins hanging open like the broken jaws of a dead animal. I moved slowly, clicking my pen and noting the tags on the seat frames, trying to ignore the way my footsteps echoed with a metallic hollow ring that that seemed to travel much further than it should have. I reached the middle of the aircraft, near the overwing exits, when I saw something that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. In seat 14B, right in the center of a row of cracked leather, sat a steaming porcelain mug and a folded newspaper. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I stared at the thin wisp of steam rising from the cup. This plane had been sealed at the Boneyard gates for over 3 years, and yet the newspaper was dated from yesterday, its edges crisp and clean against the grime of the cabin. I panned my light around the interior, my breath coming in short, shallow hitches that sounded like thunder in the silence. "Hello!" I called out, my voice cracking and sounding small against the vastness of the metal graveyard. There was no answer, only the low, mournful moan of the wind whistling through the empty rivet holes in the fuselage. I stepped closer, my curiosity fighting a losing battle with my instinct to run, and noticed that the carpet beneath seat 14B had been neatly cut away. Beneath the seat frame, a small square hatch had been fashioned out of the floorboards, leading down into the dark void of the cargo hold. Someone wasn't just visiting this plane. They were living in it, nesting like a parasite inside the belly of a dead giant. A sudden, sharp metallic clack came from the very back of the plane, near the rear galley. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the shifting of the airframe. It was the distinct sound of a seatbelt buckle being snapped into place. I swung my light toward the back, but the beam only reached as far as row 25 before the darkness swallowed it whole. I saw a flash of movement, a shadow that was darker than the rest, sliding effortlessly from the aisle into the darkness of the rear lavatory. My pulse was racing so fast I felt dizzy, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I had trapped myself in a narrow tube with only one way out. The ladder was at the front of the plane, and the shadow was now between me and the exit. "I don't want any trouble," I shouted, my voice trembling as I began to back away toward the emergency exit over the wing. "I'm just doing my job. I'm leaving right now, and I won't say a word to anyone." The response was a low, guttural chuckle that didn't sound entirely human, echoing off the curved walls of the cabin until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. Then the sound of footsteps began. Not the frantic running of someone caught, but the slow, deliberate pace of a hunter who knows their prey has nowhere to go. Each footfall was a heavy thud on the hollow floorboards, getting louder, closer, and more confident with every passing second. I lunged for the emergency exit handle, pulling with every bit of strength I had, but the mechanism was rusted solid, fused by decades of salt air and desert heat. I was trapped. I turned back to the aisle just as a figure emerged from the shadows near row 18. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in a patchwork of old flight attendant uniforms that were stained with grease and something much darker. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but he held a long, sharpened piece of aircraft skin like a jagged glass dagger. "You're sitting in my seat," he whispered, his eyes reflecting my flashlight beam with a terrifying, vacant intensity. I didn't wait for him to reach me. I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall mount and hurled it at him with a desperate scream. It caught him in the shoulder, slowing him down just enough for me to scramble over the tops of the seats, my boots tearing at the old fabric as I tried to put distance between us. I wasn't going for the door anymore. I was going for the hatch he had left open under seat 14B. I dived headfirst into the hole, my shoulders scraping against the jagged floorboards as I tumbled into the cramped, freezing darkness of the cargo hold. I could hear him above me, his boots slamming against the floor as he reached the hatch, his breath wheezing with a frantic, wet sound. I crawled through the belly of the plane, feeling my way through a maze of severed wires and hydraulic lines that felt like the cold intestines of a beast. I found a small exterior baggage door that had been left slightly ajar to let in a sliver of moonlight. I kicked at it with both feet, the rusted hinge screaming in protest before it finally gave way, dumping me out onto the hard, packed sand of the Boneyard floor. I didn't look back, but as I scrambled to my feet, I heard a heavy thud behind me. He had followed me down. I ran through the maze of stacked fuselages, my lungs burning and my vision blurring as the adrenaline began to fade. I could hear him behind me, the metallic scraping of his makeshift blade against the aluminum sides of the planes as he chased me through the narrow gaps. He knew this maze better than I did, and I could hear him cutting through the empty hulls to intercept me at every turn. I saw the glint of my truck's windshield in the distance, parked just outside the main perimeter fence. I pushed my legs harder than I ever thought possible, my heart feeling like it was about to burst through my ribs. I reached the fence and scrambled over the chain link, the top wire tearing deep gashes in my palms, but I didn't stop until I hit the dirt on the other side. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped them twice. As I threw the truck into gear and slammed on the gas, my headlights swept across the fence line. He was standing there, perfectly still, gripping the wire with his pale hands. He wasn't trying to climb over. He was just watching me, his face devoid of emotion as he raised the porcelain mug in a silent, terrifying toast. I drove for 3 hours without looking in the rearview mirror, and I never went back to collect my final paycheck. The desert doesn't just take the life out of things. It preserves the terror of their last moments in a frozen, metallic scream. I was standing in the center of the world's largest aircraft boneyard, surrounded by 5,000 hectares of dead engines and hollowed-out cockpits, when I realized that the flickering light coming from the belly of a derelict Boeing 747 wasn't a reflection of the moon. It was a rhythmic, intentional pulse, like a heartbeat made of electricity, coming from a plane that had been stripped of its batteries and wiring over 20 years ago. My job was to patrol the southern perimeter to keep out copper thieves, but as I stood there in the chilling Mojave wind, I realized that whatever was happening inside that aluminum grave was much more organized and much more lethal than a few junkies looking for scrap. I should have called it in on the radio immediately, but the silence of the boneyard does strange things to your head, making you doubt your own senses until you're standing right in the middle of a nightmare. I began to walk toward the 747, my heavy boots sinking into the soft, alkaline crust of the earth with a sound like breaking bones. The plane loomed over me like a prehistoric beast, its nose pointed toward the stars it would never reach again, and its massive shadow stretched out across the sand like a dark stain. I reached the mobile boarding stairs that had been left pushed against the fuselage, and that was when the smell hit me. Not the scent of jet fuel or old hydraulic fluid, but the rich, cloying aroma of seared steak and expensive red wine. I climbed the stairs, every rusted step groaning under my weight, and paused at the open cabin door to listen. I expected to hear the rough voices of squatters or the clink of tools, but instead, I heard the soft, elegant swell of a violin playing from a battery-powered speaker. I peeked around the doorframe and my blood turned to ice in my veins. In the center of the gutted first-class cabin, surrounded by peeling insulation and hanging wires, sat a pristine white dining table with 2 high-back chairs. There was a linen tablecloth, a silver candelabra with flickering flames, and 2 full plates of steaming food that looked like they belonged in a 5-star hotel. "You're early for the final course," a voice whispered from the darkness of the cockpit stairs, and the violin music abruptly cut to silence. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but the light hit a wall of thick, industrial plastic sheeting that had been taped across the aisle. Behind the plastic, a tall silhouette moved with a fluidity that didn't belong in a place this cramped. I reached for my holster, my fingers fumbling with the leather strap, but before I could draw my weapon, a heavy weight slammed into my back from the shadows of the galley. I hit the floor hard, the air rushing out of my lungs in a painful wheeze, and I felt the cold, hard press of a gun barrel against the base of my skull. "Don't make a sound, or we finish the dinner and the cleanup right now," a second voice growled, this one much closer and smelling of cigarettes and cheap peppermint. They dragged me toward the dining table, my knees scraping against the jagged metal tracks where the seats used to be. I saw the man from the shadows now. He was wearing a tuxedo that was perfectly tailored, but his hands were covered in thick, black latex gloves. He wasn't a squatter and he wasn't a thief, he was a stripper, but not the kind that takes parts from planes. These men were professional cleaners, the kind of people high-level cartels hire to dispose of witnesses in places where no one ever looks twice at a pile of scrap. The beauty of the boneyard is the scale of it. the man in the tuxedo said, picking up a silver knife and turning it over in the candlelight. "You can bury a body inside a wing spar, weld it shut, and in the 100-degree heat of the summer, nature takes care of the evidence before the plane is ever moved for smelting." I looked at the second plate on the table and realized it wasn't for a guest. It was a prop, a final meal for a victim who was likely already cooling in the cargo hold below my feet. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs, and I knew that if I didn't move in the next 10 seconds, I would become a permanent part of the 747's manifest. The man with the gun leaned down to whisper something to his partner, and for a split second, the pressure on the back of my head eased. I didn't think. I simply acted on pure, raw survival instinct. I drove my elbow back into the stomach of the man holding the gun, feeling the satisfying thud of his breath leaving his body. As he stumbled, I lunged forward, grabbing the heavy silver candelabra from the table and swinging it with everything I had at the man in the tuxedo. The candles went flying, the hot wax spraying across my face, and the heavy base connected with his temple with a sickening crack. He slumped over the table, spilling the wine across the white linen like a fresh throat wound. I didn't wait to see if he was dead. I turned and dived through the plastic sheeting, tearing it down as I scrambled toward the cockpit stairs. The man with the gun recovered faster than I expected, and a deafening roar filled the cabin as he fired a shot into the darkness. The bullet punched a hole through the aluminum skin of the plane, a tiny dot of moonlight appearing where the metal had been torn. I scrambled up the ladder into the cockpit, my hands slipping on the grease-slicked floorboards. I knew there was no way out through the cockpit windows. They were reinforced and wouldn't budge, but I remembered that this specific model had an overhead escape hatch for the flight crew. I jumped onto the pilot's seat, my fingers clawing at the manual release lever that had been baked into place by decades of sun. Below me, I could hear the heavy, angry footsteps of the gunman climbing the stairs, his breath coming in ragged snarls. "You're dying in this hole," he screamed, the sound echoing off the empty instrument panels. I put every ounce of my weight into the lever, my muscles screaming in protest, until I felt the seal break with a loud pop of rushing air. I shoved the hatch upward and hauled myself onto the roof of the plane, the cold desert wind hitting me like a physical blow. I was 30 feet above the ground, standing on the smooth, curved spine of a metal whale, with nowhere to hide. I looked down and saw a massive pile of discarded insulation blankets and seat cushions that had been dumped next to the plane's wing. It was a long drop, a gamble that could easily end with a broken neck, but the gunman's head was already appearing through the hatch. I didn't hesitate. I ran down the slope of the fuselage and leaped into the black void. The air rushed past my ears for a terrifying second before I slammed into the pile of foam and fabric. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and the world went gray for a moment, but the softness of the scrap had saved my life. I scrambled out of the pile, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, and vanished into the maze of tail fins and landing gear. I ran for 3 miles, never staying in a straight line, until I saw the bouncing beams of a real security patrol near the main gate. I collapsed in front of their jeep, sobbing and covered in wax and grease, trying to explain the dinner party in the graveyard. By the time they reached the 747, the table was gone, the tuxedo was gone, and the only thing left was a single silver fork and a faint smell of expensive perfume lingering in the desert air. I quit the job that night, but sometimes, when I'm eating in a quiet restaurant, the clink of a silver knife against a plate makes me see that flickering light in the desert, and I wonder how many other people are currently being cleaned inside the aluminum graves of the Mojave. The desert night has a way of turning the world into a series of jagged silver shapes, but nothing in the natural world looks quite like a field of 3,000 limbless, staring mannequins. I was standing in the middle of a massive illegal dumping ground on the outskirts of an aircraft boneyard, where the high-gloss plastic of discarded department store models caught the moonlight like polished bone. These weren't the whole, perfect figures you see in shop windows, but a literal boneyard of shattered torsos, headless necks, and tangled limbs piled 6 feet high in every direction. I had been lured out here by a series of frantic, distorted text messages from my younger brother, who had a habit of taking urban exploration photos in places he wasn't supposed to be. The last message he sent was a blurred photo of a mannequin's face, followed by 3 words that made my blood run colder than the desert wind. "It's following me." I stepped deeper into the plastic woods, my flashlight beam dancing over a sea of frozen, vacant eyes and molded smiles that seemed to mock my presence. The silence was absolute, yet the longer I stood there, the more I felt a phantom movement just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Every time I swung my light to catch the culprit, I found nothing but the same stiff, plastic poses I had seen a moment before. I started to call out his name, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the vast open space, but the only response was the dry rattle of the wind through the hollow plastic shells. I realized then that I wasn't just looking for my brother in a junkyard. I was navigating a labyrinth designed by a mind that understood exactly how to hide in plain sight. I reached a small clearing where the mannequins had been arranged in a terrifying circular formation, all of them facing inward toward a single empty chair. On the seat of the chair lay my brother's camera, the strap torn as if it had been ripped from his neck with significant force. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and scrolled through the last few images he had captured before his disappearance. The photos showed a sequence of the same mannequin, a tall, male figure in a faded gray suit, but in every frame, the figure was closer to the lens. In the final shot, the mannequin's plastic hand was reaching for the camera, and in the background, I could see the distinct, terrifying outline of a real human thumb pressing against the mannequin's chest. "He's not here anymore," a voice whispered, seemingly from the very air around me, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as a wave of pure, primal dread washed over me. I spun around, my light hitting a wall of plastic bodies, but I couldn't tell which one had spoken. The plastic woods were so dense that a person could be standing 2 feet away from me, mimicking a frozen pose, and I would never know until they moved. I realized that I was being hunted by someone who had spent years practicing the art of stillness, someone who had turned this graveyard of plastic into a hunting ground where the line between the inanimate and the living was blurred into nothingness. I began to back away, my boots crunching on the shards of broken plastic, but every direction I turned, the mannequins seemed to have shifted their positions to block my path. A sudden, sharp movement to my left caught my eye, and I saw a mannequin in a red dress tip over, its head snapping off as it hit the ground with a hollow thud. But it hadn't fallen on its own. I saw the distinct trail of a heavy boot in the sand right behind where it had been standing. I didn't wait to see the face of my stalker. I turned and bolted into the thickest part of the mannequin piles, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I crashed through rows of headless torsos, the plastic scratching at my arms and legs, until I found a narrow gap between 2 rusted shipping containers that had been dumped at the edge of the woods. I squeezed into the darkness, pressing my back against the cold, corrugated steel, and turned off my flashlight to hide my position. I could hear him now, the slow, rhythmic thump slide of someone moving through the plastic, deliberately knocking over the mannequins to let me know he was getting closer. He wasn't running. He was savoring the hunt, confident that I would eventually trip or corner myself in the maze. I looked down and saw a heavy, rusted iron pipe lying near my feet, and I gripped it with both hands, the cold metal providing a small, desperate sense of security. "I can hear your heart, traveler." The voice came again, closer this time, sounding like a man who hadn't spoken to another human being in a very long time. "It sounds so much better than the silence of my friends. Why don't you come out and join the collection? We have a spot just for you." I saw the silhouette of a mannequin glide past the opening of the containers, but this one was moving with a fluid human grace that made my skin crawl. He was holding a mannequin's arm in his right hand, but the hand of the limb had been sharpened into a jagged, lethal point. He stopped just past my hiding spot, his back turned to me, and for a second he stood perfectly still, mimicking the rigid posture of the plastic bodies around him. He was so convincing that if I hadn't seen him move, I would have walked right past him. I knew I couldn't outrun him in this maze, and I couldn't stay hidden forever. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the shaking in my hands, and waited for him to take one more step away. As he moved, I lunged out from between the containers, swinging the iron pipe with every ounce of terror-fueled strength I possessed. The pipe connected with his shoulder with a sickening crunch, and he let out a sharp, guttural cry of pain as he stumbled into a pile of mannequins, sending dozens of them cascading down on top of him. I didn't stay to finish the fight. I ran toward the distant, flickering lights of the main Boneyard road, my lungs screaming for air and my eyes stinging from the dust. I could hear him behind me, screaming in rage as he clawed his way out of the plastic pile, the sound of his heavy boots echoing through the night. I reached the perimeter fence, a high chain-link barrier topped with concertina wire, and I didn't even feel the barbs tearing at my clothes as I hauled myself over the top. I hit the ground on the other side and kept running until I reached the highway, where I flagged down a passing state trooper. When the police returned to the plastic woods an hour later, they found the chair, the camera, and the iron pipe, but the man and the sharpened plastic limb were gone. Deep in the center of the pile, they found my brother, bound and gagged but alive, hidden inside the hollowed-out torso of a massive display model. I never go near the desert at night anymore, and I can't even walk past a department store window without feeling a cold shiver down my spine. Because I know that out there, in the dark corners of the world, there are people who have learned how to be as still as plastic, waiting for the moment when you look away so they can take their place in your world.